Hello and welcome back to the fifth lecture in the Rhetoric of Story. Today, as you may be able to see, I'm recording in front of an amazing castle, the Château d'Amboise, one of the many castles in the Loire Valley, a location that inspired some of the great storytelling in history, not least the recent success of Game of Thrones. They do in fact pay an orchestra of musicians to sit outside the Château d'Amboise and remind the tourists coming here during the day that this is a location that has inspired great stories through history. One of those stories that we will be considering a little bit today is the story of King Arthur and Knights of the Round Table, which will be illustrating the theme of today's talk, looking now at the fifth of the seven major elements in the rhetoric of story, the idea of events. First four parts of the rhetoric of story work together as what we can call the engine of story. And if you dig into any great example of really compelling storytelling, be it Jack and the Beanstalk, or Homer's Iliad, or Bruce Willis's Die Hard, you will find that these four elements of the rhetoric of story working together are there at the heart as the engine driving the story down the tracks of the narrative that it's telling. And you need this engine in place in order for it to be compelling. What is this engine? Part one, change. In order to understand the world around us, we tell a story about it, and at the heart of that story we identify a great change that's going on in the world, whether that be a great war that's raging across the land, an external change, or whether it be the transition from a child to an adult going on in the heart of a character, or whether it be dealing with great and powerful emotions like grief or joy or happiness. It's this change at the heart of the story that we follow along as an audience. Number two, self. At the heart of every story is a self that is experiencing the story, because when we're telling the story of the world around us, we are the person at the center of it, and we need a self, we need a pair of eyes to see through, we need an experience to understand the story through. And driving the self along is a desire, a great desire that we're trying to achieve in the world, because this is how we understand the world around us in terms of our own personal desires and the things that are stopping us from achieving them. And as we've heard already, this can be an external desire which manifests, or it can be the more internal kind of hidden desires which really drive characters along and give us also integrally to the rhetoric of story the willpower that drives us through the events of the story as they unfold. Number three, the other. The self isn't complete without the other characters who we encounter through the course of the story, and these characters tend to be archetypal, and very often they reflect archetypal elements of the human psyche. Together the self and the other produce the fourth part of the rhetoric of story, which is conflict. It's not only us who has great desires in the world, it's everybody else that we meet. And when these desires, between our own personal desire and the desires of other characters in the story, when these clash, it inevitably produces conflict. This can be external conflicts like warfare, it can be social conflicts which are at the heart of the soap opera, or it can be the internal conflicts that rage within each of us as human beings. The interactions of these first four parts of the rhetoric of story give us what I'm calling here today the engine of story. And this is important to think about. The way that we shape these four parts of the rhetoric of story give us the power source, the engine for our storytelling. And without this, it doesn't matter which cosmetic elements we build into our story, it doesn't matter what set pieces we deploy, it doesn't matter how great our dialogue is, because all of this is powered by the engine at the heart of our storytelling. Change, self, the other, conflict. If these four elements working together provide the engine of the story, we're yet to think about the framework through which the story is actually told. And that's what I want to move into and consider in quite some depth over the next 3 talks on this course, which are going to be covering 3 separate areas, the last 3 areas of the rhetoric of story. These are going to include questions. I hope that sets a bit of a mystery for you. What do I mean by questions? We're going to get to that in the 7th talk. In the 6th talk, we're going to be looking at structure, the actual shape and form that our story is given. And we're going to be taking a bit of a shortcut about how to find the best structure for your story. But what are we going to be considering today? To answer that question, I want to ask you a question. What is a story made of? It sounds simple, and across hundreds of writing workshops with thousands of students, I have placed this question to people, and I've received dozens or hundreds of different answers. What is a story made of? If people are really interested in film, they tend to say pictures, that the story is made of a series of moving images. If people are really interested in books and writing, they tend to say words. The stories are made of words. You get all kinds of suggestions: puppets, light and shadow. Stories are made of people. Have a think about it. Tell me your answers. Note them down. What is a story made of? The idea that I want to put to you and that we're going to consider through the course of today's talk is that stories are made of events, and that it's impossible to tell a story without thinking coherently about what the most important events in the story are. Turn your imagination to the land of ancient Britain, a land ravaged by death and destruction and plague and violence. There is no king in ancient Britain in the Dark Ages. There are only warlords, knights who roam across the land, taking anything that they wish. One of these knights is the powerful Uther Pendragon, and with the help of the wizard Merlin, he has one by one defeated all of the other lords of Britain until only one remains, the Lord of Cornwall. And in battle, Uther Pendragon defeats Cornwall and reaches an agreement with him that Uther will be the High King of Britain and Cornwall will maintain control over his small part of the land. And this agreement seems to be working out, and a great feast is held until Uther sees Cornwall's wife, Igraine, and he decides that he must have Igraine, and he demands that Merlin helps him get her. And this restarts the war all over again, and Merlin is disgusted and he says, "Okay, Uther, I'll give you what you want. I'll give you the woman that you want, but your child from this match will be mine." And ultimately this decision destroys Uther. He is attacked by other knights and he rams his sword, the sword Excalibur, into a stone, and there it is left for a generation. A young boy, Arthur, grows up as an orphan with an adopted family, and he's taken to help the oldest son of that family in a great tournament, and the winner of the tournament will attempt to pull the sword from the stone, but Arthur has forgotten the sword of his older brother, and so he runs around crazily until he finds a sword sticking out of the stone, and he grabs it in his hands and he pulls it out, and in fact Arthur has pulled the sword from the stone, and it's revealed that he is the son of Uther Pendragon and the rightful High King of Britain. But of course the other knights can't stand for this, so Arthur has to ride around the kingdom defeating them one by one with the help of Merlin, just as his father Uther did, until eventually only one knight remains. And he defeats this knight in battle, and the knight says, "How can this be? You're not even an anointed knight of the realm." And so Arthur, in an act of great magnanimity, passes the knight his sword and says, "Please make me a knight, and then I can be the High King of Britain." And in this one act, Arthur shows that he is greater than all of the other knights of the realm. Having united all of the knights of ancient Britain, the now King Arthur decides to survey his new realm. But along the way, he's stopped by a foreign knight called Lancelot. And Lancelot has been travelling across the realms of Europe looking for a great lord to serve, and he will only serve a man who defeats him in single combat. Arthur and Lancelot fight, and Arthur uses the powers of Excalibur to defeat Lancelot in combat, but in the process Excalibur is broken. He tosses it into the nearby lake, and it's brought back to him by the Lady of the Lake, the true owner of the sword Excalibur, who tells him and Lancelot that they must work together to create a union of knights. And so the Knights of the Round Table are formed. Lancelot takes a journey to bring the Lady Guinevere to marry King Arthur, but of course, arriving at the castle of Guinevere's family, he instantly falls in love with the great beauty of the land and pledges his undying devotion to her. But because he knows that she is pledged to his best friend and the Lord King Arthur, he exiles himself from the Knights of the Round Table so he can never be tempted to act upon his love for the Lady Guinevere. But the witch Morgana guesses the secret of Lancelot, and she whispers it to the knight Galahad and says, perhaps the reason why Lancelot is not a member of the Knights of the Round Table is because of his secret love for Guinevere. And Galahad, appalled by the treachery of his fellow knight, calls Lancelot out, and the two men engage in single combat to decide which of them is telling the truth. And Lancelot just manages to win the combat. One night, Arthur follows Guinevere into the forest and there sees her meeting with Lancelot, and that Lancelot and Guinevere are making love, and he drives the sword Excalibur into the earth between the two lovers and then returns to the castle, where he falls into a dark and dispirited sleep. And as Arthur sleeps, the land of Britain returns to the chaos and pestilence from which he had helped it recover. And all the Knights of the Round Table are called together, and they're sent on a quest by Arthur to recover the Holy Grail, which is the only item that can restore him to his former health and return the king to the land. And the Knights of the Round Table ride out across Britain in search of the Holy Grail, and the knight Percival, the youngest of the Knights of the Round Table, finds the Holy Grail at the castle of the witch Morgana, where her son Mordred holds it. And Percival manages to fight his way into the castle, but he realizes that the Holy Grail is not an item, it's an idea. And Percival returns with the idea to the sleeping King Arthur, and he says, Arthur, the truth of the Holy Grail is that the king and the land are one. And this truth, this idea, wakes Arthur from his sleep, and he rides out to recover the land of Britain to fight against Mordred. But meeting Mordred on the field of battle, Arthur discovers that in fact Mordred is his bastard son, born from his relationship with the witch Morgana, who, although he didn't know it, was his half-sister. And knowing this, Arthur has to fight Mordred on the field of battle and ultimately slays him and is killed in so doing. And as his last act, he demands that the knight Percival takes the sword Excalibur and throws it back into the waters and to the lady at the lake from whence it came. These are the key events: King Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, the Arthurian myth, which has been told across Europe actually for centuries. It has its origins, its earliest telling in Wales and in the Celtic people, before there was even a nation of Wales. It was told in the courts of medieval France, and in fact was known across the Loire Valley, where I am today, filming in front of the Chateau d'Amboise. It's one of the oldest stories in European myth and storytelling, and what's kept it told across all of that time are the great events that the story narrates. What is an event? Hours, days, weeks of our normal mundane lives can pass without us really encountering any events. We might think that events have happened, but on the whole our lives are actually quite eventless. We continue doing most of the same things that we've always done. So we get up in the morning, we brush our teeth, we have breakfast, we go to work. We do all of our daily work tasks, we finish work, we come home, on the way we go shopping. At the end of the day we sit for a while and we watch television, and then we go to bed and we get up the next day and we do all of this over again. If you are the great King Uther Pendragon, every morning you get up and you go and slay some enemy knights. So just the fact that you're in a battle, if battle is what you do every day, doesn't mean that an event has occurred. And this is why most of the time, most of our lives are essentially eventless. Nothing really is happening, and an event is something happening. And that happening is something that is beyond our expectations and beyond the expectations of the character in the story that's experiencing them. And this is because as our minds tell the story through which we make sense of the world, our attention is focused on the unexpected. Our attention is focused on happenings, on events that occur in the course of our lives that are not the norm, that are not what we usually experience. And it's this element of the unexpected that defines what an event is, and it helps us find the events that we're going to tell the story through. Let's think a bit more about this story of King Arthur and the Knights at the Round Table. What's the first event in the story? We know the background to the story. The land of ancient Britain is in chaos. Pestilence and plague are travelling throughout the land and killing people. There are warlords. They're riding around on their horses, killing people as well. It's a dark time. Uther Pendragon rises up. Is this the event? No. We understand that this is what's happening. This is Uther's normal daily life, as weird and unusual as it might seem to us. Uther is fighting the knights one by one. He fights the Lord of Cornwall. And the first real event in the story is the unexpected. Uther, after the battle against Cornwall, attends the feast where he sees Cornwall's wife, the Lady Igraine, and he decides that he must have her. And this is the first event in the story. This is the unexpected, and this is a term we're going to think about a bit, the gap in expectation that defines the events of the story. Uther attends the feast. He thinks he's just going to eat a meal, he's going to conclude his truce with Cornwall, and he's going to go about his business being the High King of Britain. But instead the gap in expectation arises when he meets the Lady Igraine. And this is what defines all of the events of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. The next major event of the story, we move on some years. All of the knights in the land are meeting for a joust to decide who's going to try and pull the sword from the stone. But this happens all of the time. This is not the event. The event turns around now the central self of the story, the young orphan Arthur, who's just a boy at the time. And he's looking around crazily for a sword to give to his older brother, and he sees this sword sticking out of the stone and he pulls it cleanly with no effort from the stone. And Arthur, the gap in expectation, he had expected to just continue being an orphan boy serving his older adopted brother. But no, what has happened, in fact, he has become, quite unexpectedly for him, although Merlin knew this was going to happen, he has become the High King of Britain. This is an event. You turn up one day to a joust as an orphan and you leave as the High King of Britain. It's again this gap between the expectation of the character and what actually happens to them. It's the gap that defines the event, and it's from this gap that change comes. Let's look at one other event, the final major event in the story of King Arthur. King Arthur rides to battle against Mordred, and he thinks he's going to defeat the Dark Knight who has been bringing evil back into the land. He's faced with an enormous gap in his expectations. He's shown that Mordred, in fact, is his son, his illegitimate bastard son. Bastard sons play a very important part in the storytelling of this era. And again, it's this gap in expectation. What will Arthur now do? Well, he must still decide to slay his son, but in the course of doing that, he himself is destroyed. And you can see that as symbolic of Arthur ultimately being destroyed by his own sins, and then possibly being born again in the more messianic tellings of the King Arthur myth. And so it is these events with a gap in expectation that define the story, and it's from these events that we get the story's major change, because each of these events is in itself a small part of the change that the story is narrating to us. But it's the gap in expectation between what the character expects to happen and what actually transpires, and their response to this, that creates a real event. And it's so important as a storyteller to think clearly about what the events of your story are, because the mistake that less experienced storytellers make is bringing to the telling all of the happenings, all of the small of the events in the story, and really you only have so much space in a film, in a stage play, in a video game, in a whole novel, in a whole series of novels. It doesn't matter how big your story seems, you have to choose the most critical events that make the story compelling for your audience. The events of a story, however, do not exist in isolation from each other. Imagine if I set out to tell you the story of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and I begin with the great lord Uther Pendragon and the land is in chaos, and Uther is going around beating the Knights of Pendragon, but he happens to just get bored of that. So he decides instead that he's going to go on holiday, and he goes on holiday to Yorkshire. And because he already owns Yorkshire, he doesn't have to fight anybody there. So Uther is in Yorkshire, and there's also a farmer who's in Yorkshire. And the farmer has been living there for generations, and the farmer has a son called Dougie, good old Yorkshire name, and Dougie is actually a bit into the dice and the gambling and the beer, and he likes to go and have an ale of the evening. So Dougie just goes along to his tavern, and as you can see, it's actually really hard to do this, because in giving you a series of unrelated, in fact kind of non-events, I'm completely destroying any sense of a story, and you very quickly lose any interest in what I'm telling you. And I've started off by telling you that this is King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. But actually, what I've just told you are a series of random, unconnected events that don't seem to really make any sense or have any relationship to each other. And your mind, the machine of storytelling that you lug around with you in your head, very quickly gets annoyed and frustrated and stops paying attention to this. So, what is it that keeps your mind going from one event to the other? Well, let's think about the story of King Arthur as we've actually told it so far. Uther Pendragon is fighting to become Lord of the Kingdom, and he defeats the last Lord of Cornwall, and then he meets the Lady Igraine. This attracts our attention because it's unexpected, and this leads by a process of cause and effect to the next event in the story. Uther meeting Igraine leads to Arthur, and Arthur is then an orphan boy who finds the sword sticking out of the stone, and he pulls the sword out of the stone, and he becomes the King of Britain. And this leads by a process of cause and effect to Arthur fighting the Dark Knights across the land, who he has to show that he is the High King of Britain, and he can defeat them, but they still don't think he's a knight, and so he hands them his sword and says, "Dub me a knight." The unexpected has occurred again, and this leads by a process of cause and effect to Arthur surveying the land and fighting the knight Lancelot. And this is what makes a story truly compelling. Great events linked by a process of cause and effect. Once you do know the events of your story, once you do understand the chain of cause and effect that connects those events, you find that you have a tremendous amount of control over the stories that you're telling. One of the ways you can alter and change your stories is through scale. What this means is that you can tell any story that you know the events and the cause and effect for at any length. You can see this in the history of the telling of the story of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. I was able to tell this story for you in just a few minutes by simply describing the main events of the story and how they were connected. And this is the simplest way to tell a story like King Arthur. For much of its history, King Arthur was an oral tale, and it would have been told over a series of evenings at a royal court or the residence of a rich merchant, for instance. And so the story worked on a completely different scale. Each of the major events of the story would have been an episode that was presented in that evening. The version of King Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, that we're most familiar with today actually comes from the writer Edmund Mallory, Le Morte d'Arthur, which is in fact an example of an early novelistic text. It was written down, it was designed to be read by a primarily courtly, well-educated audience. And each of the major events in the story is presented as a chapter within the novel. There have also been hundreds of novelistic versions of King Arthur, all presented at that length, versions by Steinbeck, versions by T.H. White, the once and future king. T.H. White's version as a novel actually provided the structure and the form for one of the early film versions of King Arthur, which was the Disney version, The Sword and the Stone. And as a film, you can present almost exactly the same telling of the story of King Arthur, but it happens in only an hour and a half or 2 hours, and each of the major events in the story then are presented as a scene. Just as the events of a story can be told on any scale and at any length, story events also fit within each other. A little bit like a Russian doll, stories exist within other stories, and every story is part of another bigger story. In a way, stories are fractal. If you've seen on a computer, most often, very, very colourful patterns and pictures, and the more you zoom in on these patterns, the more you find that they repeat themselves. And the closer you go into the detail of a fractal pattern, you find just the same patterns reflected again and again inside. Stories are very, very similar. We can see this again in the story of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. If you take any of the key events of the story, for instance, once the knight Lancelot has been absent from the court of King Arthur because he's secretly in love with Guinevere, we have the story laid out of the accusations by Galahad that Lancelot is a traitor to the Knights of the Round Table, and then the trial by combat which unfolds, which Percival intervenes with. And this is one of the major events in most tellings of the story of King Arthur. And it reflects all of the key elements of the Arthurian tale. It features most of the main characters, King Arthur, Guinevere, Lancelot. It repeats most of the same themes of what it is to be a knight, what it is to have honour, what it is to be a strong fighter, and everything else that we understand to be crucial about the story of King Arthur. It's this fractal quality that means you can drop into almost any episode of the story of King Arthur, any of the key events, and find it at least somewhat compelling without really knowing anything else about the story. We can also expand the fractal nature of our story in the other direction. So whilst the story of King Arthur is a great epic, which can be told in just a few minutes or over many hours and many days for an epic courtly tale, it's also just one story of one king of England. And it could be presented as part of the history of England, in which case the whole story of King Arthur might only be a few sentences in the greater narrative of the entire history of a nation. And this is true of all stories, and it's a great way of getting an understanding of the story that you're working with. However epic or however intimate, you can find other stories hidden within it, and you can find that it's part of greater stories that are around it. And this is a really interesting way of thinking about story, because it leads us to understand what the basic storytelling element that we're working with is. The events of our story that contain the gap in expectation, that are part of the cause and effect of the story that we're telling, are all miniature stories in their own right. And by working them in that way, we arrive at the idea of scenes. Every part of the story is an explicit scene. Once we know what the events of our story are, we can tell that story in a multitude of different ways and at any length and crucially at any scale. So the story of King Arthur can be told as a 5-minute tale as part of a lesson, or it can be an epic sweeping drama presented as a film over a number of evenings as a courtly entertainment. Any story can really be told at any length, and all stories are made up of other stories and are part of greater tales. So the tale of King Arthur is made up of a number of stories like the quest for the Holy Grail, and it could also be seen as part of the greater story of the history of Britain and all of its kings, in which case the story of King Arthur would be but a mere sentence. And when we think about all of this together, we can see that every story, every event within our story is in fact its own story. And in order to shape an event as a story, we present it as a scene. And like any story, a specific scene has a beginning and a middle and an end. So let's take the famous scene, the drawing of the sword from the stone from King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and let's consider it as a scene. Let's think first about the beginning. In a classic story structure, the beginning is the exposition, and it's where we lay out all of the information that's required for the audience to understand the story. So what do we have in King Arthur and his early drawing of the sword Excalibur from the stone? Well, we know that we have Arthur, we know that we have his father, we know that we have his older brother, and that Arthur is a page and that he's helping prepare his older brother for a tournament. And we know that the tournament is about who is going to attempt to draw the sword from the stone, which of the knights of ancient Britain are going to have that honour. So we're going to see Arthur and his father and his older brother turning up at the tournament. We're going to see the tournament in action. We're possibly going to see the winning knight of the tournament attempting to draw the sword from the stone and failing to do so. And this is setting us our scene. It's giving us the exposition and it's giving us location. Crucially, when we think about the beginning of any story, we're trying to give a sense of location, trying to give a sense of the characters involved in the story. Middle. What's the middle of this scene of the drawing of the sword for the stone? Well, in a classic scene structure, following the exposition, is the complication. And it's in the complication that we also meet the key action of the story. So we have a series of events within the event that we're presenting. Once again, this fractal structure, stories within stories, events within events. What happens initially? Arthur is helping his brother prepare for the tournament, and he realizes that he has left his brother's sword back at the castle that they came from. And this is terrible because it means that his brother won't be able to compete in the tournament. So now Arthur is in a panic. He's found the first complication, the action of the scene has begun. So Arthur runs around and he looks for solutions to this complication. What might he do? Well, there's another knight next door. He goes and asks the knight if he can borrow a sword, and the knight says absolutely no way. Everyone needs their swords for the upcoming tournament. You won't be able to find one, Arthur. So Arthur scratches his head and he thinks, what can I do? Well, the wizard Merlin is here. I'll go and ask Merlin what I might be able to do. And Merlin says, well, perhaps if you look really hard, Arthur, you will find a sword in the forest. Merlin here is trying to shape the action of the story as it unfolds. He's a magical character in that way. So the young orphan Arthur heads off into the forest, and he does indeed find a sword, just an old sword sticking out of a stone. And he grabs the sword in his hand and he pulls it out. And now we've encountered what have we found crucially? We've encountered the gap in expectation that's at the heart of the event and that powers our scene. And everything that's come before this is about building up to the gap in expectation. And the young orphan Arthur, he runs back to the tourney and he tracks down his father and his brother, and he says to his brother, look, I found you a sword, here, take it. And his brother, of course, recognizes the sword Excalibur, but pretends that he doesn't know. And when his father asks him, was it you who pulled the sword from the stone? At first he says yes, he wants the glory, but then he says no. He has to be honest, it was his younger brother, Arthur, who pulled the sword from the stone. And all of the knights of the tournament gather around and they proclaim that because Arthur has drawn the sword from the stone, he must be the new High King of Britain. So this is taking us through the middle of the scene, and now we end the event, we end the story, we end the scene with the resolution. And the resolution to the scene comes as Arthur is being proclaimed the High King of Britain, potentially. Other knights are fighting against this, and this is giving us the cause and effect that's going to lead into the next scenes of the story. And the resolution gives us the emotion. We go into the self at the center of the story, surrounded by other characters, and we go deep into the self at the heart of the story, and we look at the emotion that the gap in expectation and his response to it has arisen. We think, what is the emotion that Arthur is left with? And in this telling of the story, Arthur is left with a sense of his own fate as the King of England. And this gives us the entire event. It gives us a complete scene. And this structure is really important. The opening, which gives us the exposition, the information that we need to understand the scene. The middle, which gives us the complication, a series of events within the event. And finally, the closing, the resolution, and the emotion to the scene. Not only is this the structure for a classically designed scene within a drama, it is a basic structure for any story that we might wish to tell. And this takes us on into the sixth part of the rhetoric of story, which is structure, and we will be coming to this in our next talk. We've looked here at a basic structure that takes a series of events, that focuses on one event within our story, and that gives it a structure. In the next lecture, we're going to look at the nature of structure in storytelling. We're going to look at lots of examples of structure, and most interestingly, we're going to look at why structure is amazingly powerful and a bit of a cheeky shortcut for you as a storyteller.